Hello everyone. This is another webinar of TD-JUG Java User Group. I'm pleased to welcome you to this webinar featuring our guest speaker, Mr. Marcus Helberg, the Vice President of Developer Relations at Vaadin. Today's topic is very interesting because, when we think of Java, we usually think that, it's just for backend development and assume it does not integrate well with front-end technologies. However, Marcus will show us how the world is changing. Before everything, I would also like to appreciate Marcus for accepting our invitation to speak on Java Meet TypeScript. Yeah. Let's turn on. Okay. I will not take the time anymore, and we listen to Marcus. We are ready to hear from you, Marcus.
Perfect. All right, thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks for having me here. So let's see that I get my screen shared here. There we go. Can you give me a thumbs up for confirmation that you can see my slides here?
Yeah, I can see.
Okay, perfect. So again, welcome everyone to tonight's, I guess it's already 7 o'clock in the evening for you. At least most of you there, whereas it's 7 o'clock in the morning here. So if anything interesting is happening today, just let me know and I'll be prepared. So today we are going to talk about combining Java and TypeScript to build full stack web applications. It's going to be mostly us live coding stuff together. So it's going to be hopefully a fun little introduction to how you can build full stack web applications where you integrate the Spring Boot backend with a React front end. So there's been lately this kind of shift in the atmosphere almost. You can feel it both on social media and kind of reading between the lines of a lot of people talking where back in the day we were building pretty simple applications, and then we had this move towards splitting out more and more things into separate microservices and kind of bringing in more and more complexities into our architectures. And you can kind of see the pendulum is starting to swing a little bit back where people are like, maybe we didn't need to go quite that far in this journey. Maybe we could actually focus on doing fewer things, but doing those things well. So here, for instance, two Java champions, Vlad Michaela and Simon Martinelli, are kind of advocating for us to kind of take a step back and really think about what are the most relevant things for us in creating software. Like, how do we actually focus on doing the right things so that we deliver a good user experience to our end users? Now, I know DHS is a pretty controversial figure, and I don't necessarily agree with much of what he says, but I think this quote was pretty spot on, saying that when it comes to kind of building large applications, replacing method calls and module separations with network invocations and separate partitioning within a single coherent team and application is madness. So when we're thinking about building one application, one unit of value for the end user, starting to split that out between things over the network can sometimes be kind of a hindrance in making us move slower. So my kind of spicy take to start off this talk is to say that I believe that full stack teams are a way for us to kind of ship value to our users faster. Now, to kind of understand why that might be the case is if you kind of contrast two ways of building an application. So if you are building not just, if you're not just a backend developer, but if you are kind of part of a larger team that's building stuff where you are delivering a end user web UI, typically you might see today a separate front end team and a backend team that are working with an API sitting between them. Whereas a full stack team, in comparison, is essentially owning that entire stack of kind of the UI layer all the way down to the backend. And why this means that they're able to be more productive in a lot of cases is that because they have ownership of the whole thing, they can do a lot of decisions on their own because the communication only happens within the team for a lot of the kind of big decisions. You can make them really quickly. meaning that you can iterate quickly and you spend less time kind of waiting for another team to do something so that you can do something. So in essence, the team is free to move a lot faster and make their own decisions on a lot of things. And this can really be a powerful thing. Now, I'm not saying that this is something that's going to work for every single use case, but I do want to challenge you to kind of think that whatever you're building, like, does it need to be as complex as it is, or could it be simpler if we kind of got people working closer together and kind of speaking together? I'm sorry, was there a question?
No, please mute your speakers, please.
So what we're really kind of doing at Vaadin is that we're trying to empower these full stack teams with tools that are specifically designed to support this type of development work, where we create a full stack framework that can kind of combines all the pieces that you need to build that piece of software into one managed package that we kind of guarantee that works together. So we ship everything from components to the front end framework to the communication layer to the back end in one single unit. The benefit here is that if you kind of do it the other way around, kind of DIY, essentially means that you have a lot of control over what goes into your app, but that control comes with a cost because you need to, first of all, select kind of all the different pieces that go into your stack. But also it means that you're essentially now in charge of also maintaining that stack for the lifetime of the application. And if you've ever done, say, a bigger React project or something, you know that as you're depending on tens of different third-party libraries, that can become quite a lot of headache over time, just trying to keep that kind of stack together so that you can focus on what you're actually interested in building. So what we're going to talk about today is our new open source framework called Hilla. Hilla is a full stack React framework that is specifically built for Spring Boot backend. So it's a full stack, meaning that we have all those pieces of the stack as one managed unit. And specifically, we are optimizing this for people who are building on Java backend. So we want to make it possible for Java developers to build really awesome web applications, essentially. Now, the way we do this, first of all, is we have a big library of UI components. These are all the building blocks you need when you are building an application. So think input fields, buttons, data grids, charts, dialogues, chat UIs, all the different pieces that you typically need when you're building an application. We've made these very customizable, so you can, with tweaking a couple of CSS properties, you can change the look and feel of these, anything from colors to roundness to spacing, sizing, so that they sort of fit into your look and feel of your company or your project that you're building. Again, the idea here is that you don't have to spend as much time doing this. You can piece together your application out of these bigger pieces, and that's something that's really, really quick. These components are built as just standard React components, so you use them through JSX the same way as in any React-based framework, and we're going to take a look at this hands-on in just a moment. But what's really kind of interesting and unique about Hilla is the way that we have tied together the front end and the back end. So, sorry, could you mute yourself, perhaps? Getting some noise here.
Okay.
Well, I'll continue on, nevertheless. So typically when you might be building a React application that connects to Spring Boot backend, you would do that or connect those two maybe through a REST API. Perhaps you're using GraphQL or something. What we're doing essentially is we want to have these two pieces feel as much as possible part of the same application. So we're actually, what we've created is a way to call Java methods from TypeScript directly through kind of an RPC. So if you take a Java class, let me see if I can get my pointer here. So if you take a Java class and annotate it with a browser callable annotation, that will make this class's public methods callable through TypeScript. So if we have this find all method here that finds all the contacts, we can then call a method with the exact same signature in TypeScript to fetch those. So we don't need to deal with kind of remembering different URLs, but also it means that this is now kind of refactor safe. So if we change something in the API that causes it to change, that would actually give us now compile time errors in the React files that get affected by this. So that's all the theory I want to do up front, because I think the best way of explaining how something technical works is by just jumping into code and building stuff together. Now, this is going to be a live code demo, so things may go right, they may go horribly wrong. If something doesn't work out, I hope you're able to help me out and point out what I did wrong, but let's get started. So what we're using is, again, called Hilla. Hilla is a Finnish word for a berry that sort of looks like this. I understand that is a I think a town somewhere in Iraq as well, maybe. I've heard from somebody in the community, but in our case, this is kind of the origin is this berry that grows up in Finland, where Vaadin is from. And we're going to use this open source framework for building our application. So I have a command line here, and I'm going to use the Hilla CLI to init a new application, and we're going to build sort of a classic address book application like this. So I'm going to use Hilla init to create it, and then we're going to cd into our address book like this. So you can see that this is a plain Maven project, and I'm going to use IntelliJ IDE to open this. You could use any IDE that you prefer. So if you like to use VS Code or Eclipse or NetBeans or anything else, that's equally fine. But in my case, I'm going to use IntelliJ. All right, so I'm going to let that get indexed. And while that's happening, we can take a look at what we actually have here. So this is a normal Spring Boot application. So we're using almost the latest Spring Boot. So we're using 3.2, and we're using Hilla version here. I'm on Java 17. We could probably bump that up to 21 now, but that's good for this demo. And to this Spring Boot starter, we've added essentially 2 dependencies for adding Hilla here. Now, we want to build a full stack application, so I'm going to add a couple more dependencies here. First one will be a Spring Boot starter data JPA. So we're going to use JPA for managing a little database. I am using GitHub Copilot here, so I'm going to get some of these like auto completions here. So I hope that's not kind of annoying to you. I think personally, at least, it's kind of interesting to try working with new tools and see how they can help us in our daily work. The other thing I'm going to use is H2, just a H2 database like this. Since we are in a Spring Boot project, it already has in its bill of materials defined a working version for H2, so we don't need the actual version number here. We can just go ahead and reload Maven here to get these 2 dependencies loaded for us. Is the font size, by the way, okay for you? You can see what I'm working on here. Maybe we can make that a little bit bigger. Okay. All right, so then again, if we look at the project that we have here, you'll see that we have the classic source main Java here. We have a application class. This is the entry point into Spring Boot. We have a service here that I'm going to remove. So we're just going to remove everything that's in the starter so we can start from a clean slate. So we essentially now have a empty Spring Boot application here. What's different with Hill is that we have this front end folder here, which is our React application. It lives in the same structure here. And the idea is that it's kind of managed by the same application. So again, I'm going to remove everything that came kind of with this starter so that we can just focus on what we want to do. So we now only have this one app.tsx, which tsx is TypeScript React file. And I'm just going to create one hello world component here, and then we're going to launch the application to see how it works. So we're going to export a component. Components in React are functions that return a piece of JSX. JSX looks essentially like HTML, but it gets compiled into JavaScript. Now, all of this is red now because we haven't actually run npm install and all of that. And that's one of the things I want to show you here. So because this is a full stack framework, we don't need to start the backend server and the front end server and dev tools and everything separately. We're just going to start the Spring Boot application by, in my case, I'm just going to run the application class here. And what that's going to do is it's going to start Spring Boot. It's going to start the needed servers for the front end as well. And it's going to kind of build a front end development bundle here once. And that's something that just happens in the beginning of the project. So as we're doing reloads here, we're going to see that we don't have to do that. So now we can see my app is running here. And once IntelliJ indexes, we're going to get rid of all of this. Now, what's really nice here is that we have kind of built-in hot module replacement and live reload. So if we make changes here, so for instance, I want to make sure that doesn't touch the screen there, so I can add a medium padding that gets applied immediately. We could say, hello, TD-JUG, and that gets updated there right away. Okay, so what I want to do then is I want to build a application for managing addresses. So your classic address book application. I'm going to use a trusty helper here to create some of the boilerplate code for us because we're lazy developers. We have better things to do. So I'm trying out Gemini for the first time in this talk. I've been using ChatGPT normally, but let's say we're building an address book demo of Spring Boot. Help me create a JP entity for a contact with name, email, phone number, include validation annotations, create the repository and a class that initializes 5 contacts. So let's see what happens. Hopefully good things happen. Okay, so we get something that looks pretty decent. So we have a contact entity ID, not blank. Yeah, that looks pretty good. We have a repository. Yes, that looks pretty good. And then we have a initializer. Yep. All right, so let's see if we can move these into my project here. So I'm just going to copy these, and a little cool tip is that if you've ever in a situation where you're copying over a bunch of classes, you can actually paste them onto your IntelliJ ID sidebar. I think the same works in Eclipse too. So I'm going to create a new package for us, data, and then I'm just going to start pasting these on top of the data package here. And we need to sort out some of these imports here, make sure that they are right. Yes, that one, that one. Then we'll need some getters and setters. It was a little bit lazy. So we need a empty constructor. Then we need a constructor that takes in name, email, and phone number. And then let me just hide the sidebar here so we have some more room. And then I'm going to create getters and setters for everything else here. Good. Okay, so now we have a entity. We are going to add a repository. So this is what Spring Data uses to actually hook up to that database so we can query things. That gives us all the basic CRUD operations like reading and writing and fetching all and saving and such. And then finally, because it's more fun to build stuff if we have some demo data, we're going to add this initializer class here. And what this is going to do, if we just quickly look at it, is it has a list of names here, and it's going to create new contacts for each of them and save them to a repository. So I haven't tried this code, obviously, since it was just generated, but we'll get to try that out very soon. So we're making good progress on our backend. What I want to do now is this Hill-specific thing called a browser callable service. So we're going to create a new service class, and we can call this our contact service, like this. So it's just a Java class that we annotate with a browser callable because we want to call this from the browser. We're not going to start setting up Spring Security right now, so I'm just going to say anonymous allowed, but here's where you could say that for this class, you're required to have a certain role, and then you can have more specific kind of access permissions on individual methods as well. So let's do a private contact repository let's do a private final, and then we can create a or inject it using Spring here. So this is automatically going to be a Spring Bean since we are in Spring Boot here. So we're going to get an instance of the repository for backend operations. And what I want to do then is I want to provide two pieces of API to our front end. So one will be a public method that returns a list of these contacts that we have. And that one can look like this. So just return whatever we get from calling find all on the repository. And then we want to have a save method that returns a contact. So again, we're delegating to the repository to actually save the contact like that. At this point, I'm going to build the application. So I'm going to do build project from here. From here on, if I do any changes, I'm just going to hit the keyboard shortcut, but that's essentially what I'm doing. And what's going to happen then is, let's see here. It's building still, maybe. Might be angry that I added those new classes there. So let's see if restarting this would take care of our problem. No. All right. What?
ولا تشي مو بجانب الكارت.
Okay, validation failed. All right, so let's see
ترى
here.
هذا جنو شلون انت صح وشتو. هذا جنو.
I'm getting some noise again. Can you maybe
Everybody, please mute your microphone, Mr. Mujib. Sorry for that.
yeah. Okay, so let's see. So we're getting some validation errors here because something is not correct here. Trying to figure out, does anyone spot where we're going wrong? So we have oh, that's not gonna work. Let's go here. I have a previous one that I tried that has a better initializer. So the problem here is it's just doing to lowercase on the name here, which has a space in it, of course, so that doesn't pass the validation. So let's try with this one instead. So lesson learned, don't copy data directly from an AI and expect it to just work automatically. All right, good. So we have our app back up and running because we have valid data now. And what we want to do then is, of course, we want to access our data from our React code. So the way React works, if you're not familiar with it, is we have a state for a component, and then we have this template that gets rendered. The template depends on the state. So whenever the state changes, the template gets re-rendered by React automatically. So the way we define a state in React looks a little weird, but I'll explain what's going on. So we're going to create a state that it's called contacts, and we're going to import this from React, and we're going to import this contact from front-end generated COM application data contact. So this is generated for us by Hilla. So we have now this type that is exactly matching what we have in Java. So we now have a state and we need to initialize it. So the way we do that in React, because this is a functional component should, in kind of React terms, be pure functions. If you want to define any side effects like calling a server or updating something outside of the component, you need to define that as a separate effect. So for that, you can use in React something called a use effect. It takes in a function that should be run, and then an array of dependencies. So essentially this reads like, whenever anything in this array changes, run this function. This is essentially just an anonymous function. By passing a empty array here means that we only want to run this once when we're creating the component. And what we want to do here is we want to take our contact service. You can see that we can autocomplete this here in our IDE, and we can use our autocomplete here to kind of see what methods we have available on our server. So we're going to call find all. This is an asynchronous call. So we're going to say whenever it's done, pass the value that we get to set contact. So now after running this, we should have our contacts in this state. So let's verify that if that is actually true. So if we loop over those with a map here, so essentially we're mapping each contact object into a list item, we should be able to see that we're now getting all of those contacts that we created in our database visible here in the UI. Now, what I said earlier in the presentation is that we have this big library of UI components that helps you build applications quicker. So instead of us starting to build out a address book out of these low-level HTML elements, let's use something more high-level like a data grid. So I'm going to use a Vaadin grid here and import that. And we're going to set that the items are equal to the contacts like this. And then we're going to close the grid tag. No, like that. And what we need to pass into the grid is the column definitions we want. So we're going to say that we have a grid column for the path of name, and similar then for email and phone. And when we save this, hopefully we're now going to have a number here. So let's see, that's actually, I think it might have been phone number. Exactly. Good. So we can see that we have those visible there. Let's make this a little bit nicer. We can say, give the middle column a little bit more width here, saying, because the emails are longer than everything else here. Now I want to build out the full kind of CRUD lifecycle here. So I want to have a form that gets selected or kind of populated with whatever contact is selected in our address book. And then as we save that, that should go to the database and get updated. So there are a couple of steps that we want to do to get there. The first is that we're going to keep track of who is the selected contact in our grid here. So I'm going to create a new piece of state called selected like this. And here again, we're having or defining a state of type contact that can also be null. So we either have a contact selected or not. TypeScript is a little bit more specific when it comes to nullability. So you can't put a null value into a type unless you specifically say that you are expecting that, just to kind of avoid unnecessary problems. So once we have that defined, we're going to add a listener on the grid saying that on active item changed, this is an event. We're going to set the value to the event details value, which we can see is of type contact. So now whenever the active item changes, we are saving that into our state here, and we're going to need that for building the form in just a bit. But also I want to make it visible, so I'm going to pass that value back into the grid, saying that selected items is equal to the selected item. So now you can hopefully see on your screen that when I'm clicking on one of these rows, it's getting highlighted here. And if we add a little piece of code here, we could say selected and let's say selected dot name like this. What this means is that whenever there's a selected value, we're going to display this. So it's conditionally rendering this span. And now you can see that as we're selecting people, we're getting that visible here. Okay, so we're not interested in just displaying a value here, but what we're interested in is actually creating a form for editing that. So let's go into our IDE here, and I'm going to create a new component. I want to split things up a little bit. So we're creating a new TypeScript file called contact form. It's going to be a TypeScript JSX file, so we can use this JSX syntax within TypeScript. And here we're going to export a default function again for the component. And let's see, return. So let's just return for now contact form like this. Make sure that we're doing this in small pieces. Everything keeps working. So we're gonna now use our contact form here instead of that span. So now we can see that it's, again, getting conditionally shown whether or not we have something selected. Now, what we want to do is actually be able to pass in this selected value and also a callback that we want to kind of delegate the saving to. So we want to tell the form like, hey, here's the thing you want to edit. And when you're done editing, call this method with the result so that we can then persist that back to our backend. So I'm going to define the interface of this component by saying that we have interface called contact form props. It'll have a contact that should be of type contact. Again, this is the generated contact value that we have. And then we want to have a on submit method that takes in a contact and returns a promise of type void. So when we're doing any operations where we're calling the backend, they're always going to be asynchronous, which means that in TypeScript terms, we're using a promise-based API. So this just means that it's not an it's not a synchronous operation, but we are going to get back a promise, then that when it completes, we'll just get a void value from there. We're gonna take these into our contact form as the properties. So again, this looks a little bit weird if you're not familiar with TypeScript. This would be the same as saying that we want to have props of type contact form props. But since I'm only interested in those two specific values that we just created, I'm using this syntax here to just pull out those specific two values into their own named variables so that we can use them. Now, if we go back here, you're going to see that the contact form is now kind of red because we're missing the contact and on submit method. So contact is pretty easy. We can just pass in our selected value there. The on submit method here, we don't have yet, so we can go ahead and create that here. So we're going to create an async function that's called on submit. It takes in the contact. And what we want to do is then call the contact service here, save, it returns a contact. And then we want to update our selected context based on that. So let's say const saved is equal to whatever we get from calling save. And then we're going to set the contacts by updating it. Again, this looks a little bit weird. We could just get all the contacts again from the backend by calling find all, but that's a little unnecessary to get all the ones if we only changed one. So what we do here is we go through all the contacts, we find the one that was changed by comparing IDs, and then we just swap that out in the array. So now we have this onSubmit method that we can pass in. So whenever we're going to save the form, we're going to call this, that calls the backend service and updates the contacts. All right. So now we actually need to implement the actual form itself because this is not super helpful. For this, we have a helper in Hilla. So we're going to create a const where we take out some properties out of what we get from calling useForm. UseForm is a Hilla specific thing that takes in two things. One will be a contact model. The model gets automatically generated, as you see. It's different from just the contact type in that it also includes information about the validation rules that we define in our contact here. So if you remember, we have these like not blank and email validations here, and we want to reuse those in our UI so that we don't have to maintain two separate set of validation rules. We're also going to pass in the onSubmit method here. This is a shorthand for saying that the onSubmit should be this onSubmit method that we just got in. So this is just a kind of convenience method here. Again, calling use form will give us back, if we look at this, we'll get a use form result that has probably like tens of different things in there, but we're not interested in all of them. So we're going to use this object destructuring to only pull out the pieces that we want. So we want to have a field directive, we want to have a model directive, we want to have a submit callback, and a read method. So with those, we can now start building out the UI. We're going to have a text field and almost look like what GitHub Copilot thinks it looks like, but this is actually going to be type safe. So we're going to use the model instead to bind it to the model.name like this. We're going to do the same for email and for phone number like this. Then finally, we'll need a button for actually saving. So whenever that gets clicked, we're going to call submit. All right, so again, let's go ahead and save this and see that we're on the right track. So if we select something now, you can see all those fields. They don't exactly look the way we want them to look, and also they're not getting populated yet, but we're making some decent progress here. So let me just first fix the look and feel of the form. So add some class names here using our utility classes. Very similar to Tailwind. You can actually use Tailwind itself with Hilla if you prefer that, but this is kind of a lightweight subset of Tailwind. So we're going to turn this into a CSS grid. So say grid calls to with a small gap between elements like that. Say items baseline. So the button gets aligned. That looks pretty good. For the button, we're going to use one of the variants that we ship in here. So we're going to say theme should be equal to, I don't know, let's see, primary, like that, make it stand out a little bit more. And finally, you can see we haven't used this read value yet. And what we want to do is whenever the value passed in through contact changes, we want to read in that new value that's bound to the fields. And if you remember from the first component we built, whenever we have a side effect of any kind in React, so where something changes to in this purely functional component, we need to define that as an effect. So we're going to use an effect again. It has this function that gets called, and then an array of things that we want to listen for. So in our case, we're going to say that whenever the contact changes, we want to read in that contact. And as you can see right now, that got applied. So now that we select some line here, that gets selected here. Now, if things went well, we should be able to change something here. So say, change this to Janet Smith, hit save, and that gets updated now here. And if we refresh, you can see that actually gets persisted across refreshes because we did say that all the way to the database. So that's pretty cool. You can see that we have like this little dot here indicating that it's a required field, and that's coming from here. So you can see we have this not blank annotation here. Same for email. So if we try to have an invalid email, it's going to give us the same message that we defined here, saying that that's not possible to do. Now, this is actually pretty cool, in my opinion, is that it doesn't just do this here for kind of convenience. So if we look at what's happening here, we can see that, okay, we're submitting this. But if we were to kind of pretend we're hackers here for a little bit, we could copy this as a fetch and try to replay this, but with kind of invalid value. So say I'm going to remove the @ from the from the email here so that it's not a valid email anymore. And let's remove the name as well and see what happens if we now try to send this to the server. And it's going to actually give us back a 400 value here saying that that's no good because we actually failed the validation rules that we had set in place here. So it's actually pretty cool. If we now go here, we can see that in the response there was actually information about which validation rules failed and why you weren't able to do that. So we're simplifying the way that you can do validations by only needing to define them in one place, and then you can reuse them both in the UI for the user's convenience, but then we rerun them on the server so that you can kind of feel confident that when you're actually in your contact service here, when you're within the method here, you know that whatever's got passed in has passed the validations that you had. Okay, so I wanted to build this whole thing just to kind of show you the underlying mechanisms of how all of this works. But since we are a full stack framework, we can take things a whole lot farther than kind of anyone else can in this space. So what we did so far is sort of like React and Spring Boot, but maybe, I don't know, 20% nicer because you have this type safe communication and you have like shared validations and stuff, but it's still like only marginally better. And this is kind of where things start becoming cooler because now we're at a point where we can actually start helping you a whole lot more. And let's see how simple we can actually turn this into. So let's go ahead and actually remove everything from our contact service and instead extend from a CRUD repository service. And this will take in the type of thing we want to edit, contact, its primary key, and the repository that we can use for editing it. The repository needs to not only extend JPA repository, but also a JPA specification executor. And that's because we want to automatically be able to support things like filtering and sorting, and that's something that the JPA spec can already help us do. All right, so now our contact service is still browser callable, but instead of us implementing anything, we're just extending this existing CRUD service. So that's already simplifying some things for us. We're going to go ahead and build the project again so that the TypeScript gets regenerated. Now, hopefully, in our UI code, we're going to see all kinds of things that are now broken. So again, we changed the backend API and we're getting compile time errors in our UI. But that's okay, because we can go ahead and just remove a lot of this stuff here because we don't necessarily need it. Instead, we're going to use a auto CRUD that takes in a service, in our case, the contact service, and a model, which is, again, this contact model that contains information about validations and such. And what we should hopefully have now is a full-on CRUD component that's bound to the database. So if we, again, go and change, say, Jane to Janet, hit submit, that's going to be saved here, and it's going to be persisted across refreshes. Now we could go ahead and make this a little bit nicer. So let's add a class name here, say or actually flex grow, and make this a flex. Cool. So I'm turning the outer layout into a flex box and giving a median gap between things, and then I'm gonna have that one grow and say h. Cool, maybe. Let's see what's going on. All right. Well, doing something odd here, but the idea was to have this grow. Must have typoed something. If anyone spots what I'm doing wrong, you can go ahead and let me know. But anyway, the idea is that since we are building a full stack framework, we are able to kind of give you functionality on a very high level of abstraction where we can take care of a lot of the boilerplate that goes into coding applications. You still have access to all the kind of underlying stuff and you can customize how things work. But if you just want to crank out UIs very quickly and kind of have those tied to your Java backend, that's something that you can do really, really easily with Hilla. All right. So that's all I wanted to show code-wise. We are getting towards the end of our time slot here. So I want to just recap what we have here and then save a little bit of time for questions. So what we looked at today is our open source Apache licensed framework called Hilla, which is a React full stack framework designed specifically for Java backends, more specifically Spring Boot backends. It's designed to help full stack teams work quicker by automating a lot of things that you would normally have to do separately when you're building an application that has a separate front end and a back end. We do this by things like type-safe RPC communication, shared validation logic, and these higher level full stack components that kind of encompass both the front end and the back end of your application. Now, I was kind of sad that we had this talk today and not say 2 days from now, because we have a really cool new launch coming out soon, and I was this close to actually having a working alpha ready that I could have showed some of the cool new features that we have coming soon, but you'll have to kind of go on our website and check them out. But we're simplifying how you can actually add new views. So instead of having to define a kind of configure a React router, you can just add TSX files into a folder and they will get picked up as routes. What's even cooler though is that because this is a full stack framework, you can add metadata to that view, saying like this view should only be accessible by anyone with a role admin, and it will actually also go ahead and configure Spring security based on that information. So it's not only securing that route in your client side, but it's also making sure that it's the same rules apply on the client. The other thing that we're adding is full stack signals. We didn't have a chance to kind of look at signals here today, but they are a way that a lot of front end frameworks are today starting to kind of look at how to manage state. Signals are essentially a reactive value store. So very similar to what we had with use state here. But the thing is that they're not tied just to a specific component instance. So you could share a signal value between different parts of the UI, bind many things to the same part. And whenever the value of that signal changes, it would be very kind of efficient at only updating the things that need to be changed. So that's something that a lot of front-end frameworks are doing, but we're thinking again, well, what can we do with this full stack framework that we have that would be kind of easier for people to build something that's difficult to build today? So what we're going to allow people to do is define the signal value in Java and subscribe to it on the client. And this can be a shared value as well. So you could have, say, currently online users as signal value, and then as people come and go, everyone's UI would get updated immediately. Or you could build collaborative features where if somebody's editing one field, everyone else can see that value immediately getting updated on their screen as well. So we're at a point where we're able to add a lot of really cool features that take advantage of this fact that we are specifically optimizing the experience for people on a Java backend. So we have some really cool stuff coming along. So hopefully you can, if this looked at all interesting to you, just be sure to follow us on some of the social media for updates here. You can find everything that we were just looking at on the Hilla website on hilla.dev. And if you're interested in reaching out to me, you can always find me at Marcus Helberg on most social media. And with that, I want to thank you all for coming, and we have plenty of time for questions if there are any. So maybe Reza, you can help me out to read any questions we might have.
Anybody can have a question?
Yeah, actually, I have one. Thanks for your presentation. It was awesome. I have a question that this framework is a self-friendly framework, like like Next.js that we can use in interface, and Google visit that in a friendly routing, or just as a handle we can use it?
Not entirely sure if I understood your question. Are you able to rephrase it maybe?
Sure. As you know, React.js is not a so-friendly library, let's say, because routings and everything changed in JavaScript. And when Google is going to, the robots
Okay.
are crawling the website, it sees a empty website, but Next.js came to solve this problem. Yeah, my question about.
Okay, good. Now I got it. So the question is really about, like, does Hilla support server rendering and that way kind of optimized for SEO?
Exactly. Yeah.
So and that's a good point that I should have made clearer, I think, upfront. So specifically with Hilla, we are trying to target and kind of help people build more business apps. So less kind of websites that would kind of be SEO optimized, and more kind of dynamic applications where you're dealing with a lot of CRUDs and forms and data. So right now, we don't have server-side rendering as a high priority, because that's not something that's very kind of important for a lot of the internal facing business applications that we are primarily targeting. It is something that's kind of in our backlog of things to look at, because there's no reason like why we couldn't support that if there is kind of community demand for that. But right now we're optimizing more for building these types of like more complex applications that are typically kind of hard to build if you're just going at it with kind of more low level components.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Any other question?
Hi, Marcus. I have a question.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
I can hear
I have
you.
a philosophy question. Basically, I'm a backend developer, and I'm focusing on solving the problems in backend side, software development, like performance, multi-threading, or concurrency, etc. I have a small experience in front development side. What do you think? How we can adapt to be a front end and back end development at the same time? Is it a good way to continue in back end side only, or no, to be on full stack development and focus on front end and back end side at the same time? How I can adapt to be a full stack developer?
Yeah, I mean, a good question. I think first and foremost, probably has to do with your interests as well. Like, is that something that you're interested in pursuing at all? Like, is it interesting to you? Today, we were only looking at one of the open source frameworks Vaadin has. We have another framework, let's see, Vaadin.com here, framework called Flow. And Vaadin Flow is actually a framework that's has the same philosophy underneath it. So it's designed for full stack teams, but the difference is that everything in Vaadin Flow is Java. So you're able to build the same exact view, but instead of using HTML and TypeScript, you are defining each component as a Java object that you add to a layout. And so kind of to answer your question, like if you just want to, if you're happy to be mostly a backend developer and really kind of focus your efforts on kind of honing your skill as a backend developer, but at the same time, sometimes you want to build some utility apps for yourself or for your team, just kind of build some UIs, or just want to build an application fully in Java. This is another really interesting framework that you could take a look at. Hilla is then kind of designed more for teams where you have either people who are like individually skilled in both front end and back end development, or where you have kind of a mixture of people within the team where some people are more front end and other people are more back end. So we're really kind of trying to cater to two different types of developers and teams with them. So I think to answer your question about like, should you pursue looking into front or like full stack development or not, it would really much be kind of dependent on what your interests are in the area. So I think if you really like backend development and you feel like you want to kind of improve on your craft at being a good backend developer, that's a perfectly good way forward. If building full stack applications is something that seems really interesting to you and you're like, well, I've always wondered a little bit about how that works, it's certainly like an interesting thing to explore. And I do think that one kind of potential value of doing that is that if you have the skills by yourself to kind of deliver the entire unit of value, something like all the way from the back end to the actual end user, that can kind of let you do some pretty cool stuff even on your own in hobby projects and stuff.
Thank you, Moose. Thank you.
All right. Well, like I said, you can
Hello there.
read.
May I
Yeah.
ask a question?
Of course, please.
Hello. Actually, I was wondering that, firstly, thank you for your great presentation. And I was wondering that if there is any special tools for testing, or we can just use the third-party tools for testing the whole application or any units or any API.
Yeah, good question. So yeah, with the framework, our philosophy has been really to try to avoid reinventing wheels as much as possible. So we're built this out of like very industry standard pieces. So we have things like Spring Boot and React and things that already have very strong ecosystems around them. So you can test your Java code with JUnit the same way as kind of you're already familiar doing. You can test React code with React tools. If you want to do end-to-end testing, Playwright, for instance, is a really good tool for doing that. So we're really trying to avoid having to tell people that they need to start using new tools or learning new things just for this. So for kind of all intents and purposes, this is still just a normal React application. You can use you can npm install any other React components there or use any React compatible libraries with it, just the same way as with any other framework. So it's really just that it's more managed, opinionated in that sense.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Even though it was early in the morning, your time zone, it was a really great presentation. Again, I appreciate you for accepting our invitation. Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much for having me. And thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.